Welcome to week 2, where we talk about some of what we learned in the geography portion last week and apply what we learned about it to climate. And we learned a little bit, for example, about latitude and longitude, and we'll talk today about what Antarctica's latitude means for its specific climate later this week. And we'll also learn a little more about why Antarctica is so windy and cold. But the first lecture of climate this week, lecture 3, will have a bit more to do with some basics of Earth's climate, an overview of why differences in latitude actually relate to differences in climate in different parts of the world. So there is a seminar being hosted by UC Riverside happening on Tuesday, April 6th at 10:30 a.m. And if you want to do extra credit, but you can't make the regular department colloquia that occur Thursdays at 2 p.m., this is a good opportunity. And I can tell even from the title that if you don't have a lot of chemistry background, this might be a bit hard to follow, although I could be wrong. Professor Kramer here could be fantastic at outlining that. And actually, I generally want to believe the best in that, but all of us, including me, always have moments when we could do more to connect with the experiences of those who don't have a lot of background in the field we do. And one angle you can take if you happen to go to an extra credit talk that you don't understand very much of is to write about what you do understand, what you don't understand, and possibly also what you think the professor or the speaker could have done to make it a little more approachable. And also Lab 1 on maps is due this Friday, April 9th at 11:59 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. The TA sections start on Tuesday, April 5th, and I highly recommend that if you haven't already looked over the lab and the files needed on GauchoSpace, that you do so in case you find yourself struggling or if you have questions that come up. Because the less that is done at the last minute, the easier it's going to be on you and on the TAs as well. So here is a short summary of lab this week, as well as of what I'm trying to get at by assigning the videos and the readings. For Lab 1, in addition to reviewing the material that the TAs have posted, it's worth reviewing Lecture 2A. If you haven't already watched that, go ahead and do that. The TA sections start tomorrow, and so as soon as you can, check over the lab materials. Now, as for the video clip I've linked on GauchoCast, I've put some questions to consider here. And this might help you with studying for the quizzes in the midterm, since there will be a handful of questions on both that relate to the videos and the readings. And in particular, they are a likely source of questions on the quizzes for the short answer questions. On Monday, April 12th, I will be hosting a review session where I will very heavily focus on the format of the quiz and questions you might expect to see on the quiz. Now, Article 1, which is about the Antarctic circumpolar current, which we'll learn more about on Wednesday's lecture, it's a rather different article from the other two. It's an example of a scientific journal article that would be a good article to choose for assignment number 2, which is going to be due later in the quarter after the midterm. And like a lot of academic articles, it is rather dense. It is also on the long end of the range of lengths I would recommend choosing for article number 2, for assignment number 2. And I find that shorter is often better for this class. A long paper isn't necessarily a good paper, and a short paper isn't necessarily a bad paper. I largely chose this one because it was a fairly recent paper on the Antarctic circumpolar current, which we'll talk about in depth on Wednesday, and it gives a bit of an in-depth behind-the-scenes look into research as to when it opened. So it kind of gives you a sense of what sort of background and what sort of terms are used in the actual science being produced about the material that I'm, by and large, giving you a summary of. And the circumpolar current is important because when it opened up, that's when Antarctica became the borderline uninhabitable desert that it is today. And so this article is important for pinpointing when that happened. Don't worry about taking detailed notes, but some questions to consider that I've put on this slide are: what is the question the authors are trying to answer? What materials did they study or work with to get the question? And what connections are there between this article and the material that we cover in class? And then articles 2 and 3 should be more straightforward. Those are good examples of news articles about science that you could use for assignment number 1. So today we'll start with broadly talking about solar radiation and how that energy circulates around Earth and what that means for Antarctica. We will also talk about the Coriolis effect a bit, which will come into play regarding ocean circulation on Wednesday's lecture. And we'll start to get into the consequences of atmospheric circulation for Antarctica's climate. Because Antarctica is a cold, dry place. The long result of the long-term goal, I hope, or the overall goal of this lecture is for you to understand why is Antarctica so dry, cold, and windy as well. Good place to put this. And so this is a bit of a simplification, but one factor is that the sunlight reaching different latitudes is hitting the different latitudes at different angles. Now, one way to think about light is that you have the same amount of sunlight hitting, you have the same amount of sunlight coming from the sun and reaching the Earth at each latitude, but you are spreading the same amount of sunlight across a different amount of surface area. And this is what I mean when I say angle. At the equator, what is happening is that the sunlight is hitting the Earth just about perpendicularly at about a 90-degree angle. And so the beam is very concentrated. And the same amount of sunlight is being spread over, say, 1 foot or 1 unit, but let's say 1 foot. Somewhere between the poles and the equator, at temperate latitudes like those of us in California live in, the sunlight is hitting at a bit of an angle that is less than 90 degrees. It's hitting it a bit more obliquely. And so that means the light is being spread across, say, 1.5 feet. And that makes it less intense and it feels weaker because of that. At the pole, what's happening is that, actually, I would say this last example is closer to what's happening maybe in, like, I guess Alaska, like close to the pole, but not quite there. The sunlight is being spread over 2 feet. The angle between the beam of light and the surface is even shallower. Now, at the poles, essentially what is happening is that when sunlight is reaching them, they are hitting at almost a 0-degree angle. They're basically glancing the surface of the Earth, and the light is very spread out, and thus it's felt very weakly. A way to think about it is that you have a set amount of frosting to start with, and you can either spread it over 1 cupcake or over a dozen cupcakes. And the poles are the dozen cupcake situation. The same amount of light is hitting the Earth no matter the latitude, but since Earth is curved, that causes the amount to be spread out more in different latitudes than others. And it is less spread out at the equator and more spread out at the poles. And the figure on the lower left is meant to illustrate that. And the diagram on the upper left draws a connection to what this looks like on Earth. Notice also that the amount of energy in the atmosphere is not the same at noon at different latitudes, as you can see in this diagram here. This top curve represents the equator, and it shows that the energy is quite intense at noon, which is when the sunlight is hitting Earth most directly. But at the polar noon, even at the point at which the sunlight is hitting the Earth most directly, it's still quite spread out, and so it heats up the air less effectively, and so less energy is felt. Now, aside from this, the tilt of Earth's axis also plays a large role as to why Antarctica is so cold, because it means that not only is the sunlight reaching Antarctica carrying less energy, the amount of sunlight, or you could put it the amount of solar radiation reaching Antarctica, varies heavily throughout the year, leaving it dark and especially frigid for much of it, for either the Arctic or the Antarctic winter. And the poles would be colder than the equator, even if Earth was not tilted at an angle, because Antarctica would still experience more spread out sunlight because the Earth is curved. However, it would get more consistent sunlight and more warmth throughout the year. And as a result, we throughout the world would essentially not have seasons. And seasons are actually a result of Earth's axis being tilted. And this causes all latitudes except for the equator to receive slightly different amounts of sunlight throughout the year. The points along the equator are the only places on Earth that get the same amount of sunlight and the energy it carries in the form of solar radiation the entire year long. And I like the diagram on the right because it shows that even when it's nighttime in the Western Hemisphere, speaking of just in terms of time, because remember, longitude is all about time, you can look closely and see that Greenland and Baffin Island are still in light because of the way the Earth is tilted. This is the summer in the Northern Hemisphere, when the tilt of Earth's axis is pointed towards the sun in the Northern Hemisphere and away from the sun in the Southern Hemisphere. So it's summer in the northern hemisphere. This would be like in June. However, in the southern hemisphere, it's winter. The days are shorter in Argentina and Mozambique and Australia. And if you get far south enough to where the Antarctic Circle is, for at least part of the year, you're going to have total darkness. You're going to have at least one 24-hour period of total darkness. So this is the Antarctic winter. It's winter in Antarctica in June, so that's when actually you have fewer people in Antarctica. Meanwhile, in our December, it's actually summer in Antarctica. The northern hemisphere is pointed away, and I like this example over here shows you how that corresponds with calendar months. But in December, the northern hemisphere is pointing away from the sun, and the southern hemisphere is pointing more directly towards it, so you'd have the reverse of this. Antarctica would actually be bathed in sunlight, and the Arctic would be dark. And one thing I want to note is that the Earth has an elliptical orbit. It's not a perfectly circular orbit, and that doesn't actually end up having all that much to do with seasons. It brings about a small difference in solar radiation, but it's not much of one compared to the difference caused by the tilt. Because if you look at the Earth, you'll notice that it maintains the same orientation as it goes around this loop. It doesn't like flip around as it goes. You'll see that it's tilted towards the right of this screen in December. It is still tilted towards the right here in March, still tilted towards the right in June, and then same in September. You'll notice that that's just causing different hemispheres to experience lots of sunlight versus no sunlight or very little sunlight at different times. So what exactly is radiation? So light isn't just visible light. There's an entire spectrum of radiation, what you'd consider the electromagnetic spectrum, and that ranges in wavelength from tiny wavelength gamma rays, which are the energy put out during radioactive decay, or gamma decay specifically, and then that ranges to long wavelength waves like the radio waves that we listen on. And a wave in general is defined as an oscillation. There's a specific type of wave that are electromagnetic waves, aka light waves. And they are defined by their wavelength, which is the distance between either two peaks, two high points, or two troughs, two low points. And in the case of electromagnetic waves, or the various light waves, longer wavelengths are going to be associated with less energy, and shorter wavelengths are going to be associated with more energy. So think about gamma rays. Gamma rays are a type of radioactive decay. They can and do kill people and other living organisms, in part because they can damage, well, they can damage things on the atomic level. They can cause horrible radiation sickness. Meanwhile, radio waves are essentially harmless. They exist all around us all the time, and they're only picked up and rendered into intelligible data, aka sound, by special transceivers, and they don't affect us much otherwise. And wavelength is the inverse of frequency. Higher frequency waves, aka waves when you get more peaks coming per second, tend to have higher energy. The sun emits all kinds of radiation, but we're mostly concerned with infrared light, visible light, and ultraviolet light. So visible light, the wavelength range that we can see, and then the two categories on either side of it on this spectrum. Now, infrared light is considered long-wave radiation because it has a longer wavelength than visible light. And we can't see it, but we can register its presence as heat because it does affect our bodies somewhat, even though our eyes can't pick up on it. Now, actually, there are some organisms like pit viper snakes that have special organisms, the pits below their eyes, and that helps them visualize this infrared radiation instead of just feeling it. Then visible light has a shorter wavelength than infrared light, and ultraviolet or UV light has a shorter wavelength than both visible light and infrared light. And they are considered, both visible and ultraviolet are considered to be shortwave radiation. Visible light is simply the spectra of wavelengths that us and most living organisms with eyes can see. Ultraviolet is the spectra of wavelengths immediately above that. Now, a handful of organisms like bees can actually see ultraviolet light. We can't see it, but like many things we can't see, it still affects us. Ultraviolet light is capable of damaging our cells and causing skin cancer, among other problems. It's harmful to us as well as other organisms, and we'll learn about how the ozone layer in Earth's atmosphere actually helps regulate the amount of ultraviolet light that actually reaches the surface. But it's a good thing to note that the sun is more or less constantly powering at the same rate and producing the same amount of radiation. You have some variation from sunspots or the dark spots on the sun, which are a bit cooler, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about climate change later in the course. But to begin with, even though you have this gigantic amount of radiation being released from the sun, a lot of that is not actually absorbed by the Earth. And we will talk about how some parts of the Earth can use the light more effectively, but there's also the fact that the amount available is only a fraction of what gets emitted. The same way that we will later on in the course find out that plants cannot convert the solar energy that does reach Earth to energy with 100% efficiency. Now, Mercury, which is the closest planet to the sun, gets the most intense radiation because of a mathematical rule known as the inverse square law. Since the orbit of Mercury has the smallest radius, the light is spread out less than when it reaches Earth or Neptune or Pluto or whatever else is in the solar system. That's one reason why Mercury is actually not considered to be a habitable planet. It gets too much sunlight, and it gets, as a result of that, too much ultraviolet radiation mixed in with that sunlight. And because Mercury doesn't have much of an atmosphere, there's really nothing protecting it from any of this radiation. And so anything on Mercury just gets killed within seconds. And in fact, space probes sent to Mercury tend to tend to get damaged very quickly if they get anywhere near it. Actually, that's Venus I'm thinking of. Venus is a little bit closer to the sun and still has a bit of the same problem. It's a bit farther from the sun. Excuse me, I'm digressing here. So on Mercury, basically, you have so much radiation and so much ultraviolet light that it would kill anything. But then you go out to Earth, and we're getting a more spread out and thus less intense amount of solar radiation. And then you go out to Saturn and Uranus, and the light is so spread out that there isn't even enough for any plants or other photosynthetic organisms to do photosynthesis. So that's why Earth is in the habitable zone. It's balanced between the extremes of too intense sunlight and too spread out sunlight. And that's sometimes referred to as the Goldilocks conditions because it's a balance between being not too cold and not too hot. It's in the range that can support life. Venus and Mars are also considered to be in the habitable zone, but they've had other factors that have interfered with the development of life, either complex or any, quite honestly. Now on Earth, not all of the solar radiation that actually reaches the Earth makes it to the surface. About 29% is reflected by particles in the atmosphere, and then 23% is absorbed instead by particles in the atmosphere. The atmosphere is made of gas molecules that can either absorb or reflect light depending on the molecule. And ultimately, less than half of the radiation that reaches Earth actually reaches the surface and becomes available to plants to do photosynthesis with. Now, the amount of solar radiation reaching Earth is more or less a constant during our lifetimes, but over geologic time, the entire planet will experience some variation based on three factors. The first is how elliptical or eccentric the Earth's orbit is, and over the course of 100,000 years, the Earth's orbit will go from more circular to a rather flattened oval, and then back to almost circular again. Over about 41,000 years, meanwhile, the angle of the tilt of Earth's axis of rotation will increase from 21.5 degrees to 24.5 degrees, and then back to 21.5 degrees over that range of time. And this will affect how intense the seasons are and how much radiation the poles receive. It will affect where the Arctic and Antarctic circles actually are, which is why I mentioned that the Antarctic Circle has not been fixed over geologic time. Lastly, in addition to having an angle, the Earth's axis faces a certain direction into outer space. And this, one way to think about direction in outer space is you see different constellations at different times of year because we're facing in different directions. Now, Earth's axis faces a certain direction out into outer space, and this direction itself varies over time as part of the precession cycle, which is separate from the angle that the axis is tilted at. It is a completely separate cycle. And one way to think about it is that Earth is a spinning top. Like a spinning top or dreidel's handle is going to point in different directions as it wobbles around and rotates. And on a slow scale, that's what's happening to Earth. All of these explain changes in climate over long periods of time, since they affect how much solar radiation is reaching the Earth. But they change on too slow of a scale to be responsible for the climate change we're seeing in the 21st century. They have, however, tentatively been linked to periods of increased and decreased ice during Earth's most recent ice age. And you can notice how there's a combined signal that is correlated roughly with periods in which there is lots of ice and periods in which there isn't much ice. And they don't absolutely correlate 100% because there are factors involved in Earth's climate other than Milankovitch cycles. And we also haven't always had ice. Milankovitch cycles have gone on over various periods of Earth. They've gone on throughout Earth's history, but Earth has not been in an ice age. There have been periods when the combined solar radiation from the combined effects of the Milankovitch cycles was overall rather low, but there still wasn't any ice. And not to mention that even though this somewhat erroneously says no ice, during periods in which there have been periods in which the solar radiation has overall been rather high when there was still ice, just less of it than there had been, say, 100 million or 100,000 years ago. And other factors play into climate as well, like plate tectonics and geography. But there is some correlation between Milankovitch cycles and the increased or decreased amount of ice. One way to think about it is that once the process is started, once ice is present, then Milankovitch cycles start to factor in. Now, returning to radiation, an important thing to realize is that the vast majority of energy on Earth and that cycling through the atmosphere is from the sun, but some of that is indirect in a sense. The Earth itself is not a luminescent object. It doesn't produce light that we can see. However, it does emit radiation in the sense that some of the radiation that comes to Earth, particularly as visible light and UV radiation, is absorbed by the planet and essentially converted to infrared radiation. It is absorbed as visible light and ultraviolet and re-emitted as infrared. So let's take an example. It's referred to as black body radiation because this is, say, a metal ball that is not emitting any it's not emitting any visible light whatsoever. It's not reflecting any visible light whatsoever. It's an idealized object that absorbs all radiation and doesn't reflect any. However, it will still be emitting some long wave, low energy radiation after absorbing visible light and high energy radiation from the sun. It converts it into infrared radiation and lower wavelengths than that. So essentially, the Earth emits infrared radiation, and it turns out that is actually what more effectively heats the lowermost part of the atmosphere, because as it turns out, air is densest in the lowest atmosphere. Solar radiation does a more effective job of heating the uppermost atmosphere, but that actually contributes less to global climate than you would think, because as it turns out, there actually aren't that many air particles in the upper atmosphere. The air is less dense up there. So a lot of weather on Earth, in summary, is somewhat indirectly driven by solar radiation. It's actually driven by the trapping of infrared radiation. And the same is actually true related to the greenhouse effect. So the ultraviolet light that is absorbed by water and land, if it hasn't been absorbed or backscattered or reflected by things in the atmosphere like CO2 molecules or water vapor molecules, dust, etc., the oceans and the land will subsequently release heat. That is infrared radiation. That's the infrared radiation that has been converted from the incoming ultraviolet and visible light radiation. Now, a lot of this infrared radiation escapes back into space. And that's what's happening on the right side of this diagram. The infrared radiation is being emitted by the land and the ocean, and in some cases it's being absorbed by clouds. A lot of it's escaping back to space. The really important thing, though, is that carbon dioxide and other gases known as greenhouse gases absorb some of that infrared radiation and release it again in all directions, including back towards Earth. And that is the greenhouse effect. That is what causes atmospheric warming, because heat that otherwise would have gone out to space has been trapped by carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases. Now, left in a runaway state, this ends up with a hothouse, uninhabitable Earth, which is exactly what's happening now. But some greenhouse gases are necessary as a regulation function to prevent all of the radiation from going back out into space. And that is essentially what is the case with Mars today. Mars has too few greenhouse gases. Venus, meanwhile, has way too many, so it's become uninhabitably hot. It's also closer to the sun than us, so too many greenhouse gases, also plus a stronger amount of solar radiation than that which reaches Earth, leads to a runaway greenhouse effect. Now, something that's a bit hard to shake and that I struggled to shake for a long time is that you can't think of Earth's atmosphere as nothing. Nothing is the vacuum of space, but Earth's atmosphere is made of very widely spaced atoms and molecules, and most of the molecules are actually nitrogen molecules in the form of N2 gas, aka two nitrogen atoms bonded together. N2 gas is essentially useless. There are some microorganisms that can actually break it down into compounds like nitrates, which are useful nutrients for living things. And that actually very heavily limits the amount of nitrogen that's available for living organisms, because only a very small number of microorganisms can actually do it. And this is because N2 has a triple bond that takes a lot of energy to break. And the only organisms that can do it are some bacteria um, that in one case have formed a symbiotic relationship with the family of plants known as the legumes. That includes peas, beans, and some and lentils and some other related plants, which is one reason why those plants are actually grown as nitrogen fixers. They replenish the soil because of the bacteria that live in their roots. But when we breathe in N2 gas, more or less nothing happens. Meanwhile, the second most abundant gas, by a much distant 21%, is oxygen gas in the form of O2, two bonded oxygen molecules. And almost all organisms rely on it for aerobic respiration, which is what allows cells to receive energy. And plants, which don't need oxygen to breathe, still do need some oxygen to perform aerobic cell respiration. And the reason we need to breathe is because we need to bring oxygen into our bloodstream so that our cells can produce energy from the food we eat. And if we don't have any oxygen, we die. And patients who need more oxygen than what is available in the air, people whose bodies really struggle to get enough oxygen, are given nearly pure oxygen that is concentrated from the atmosphere. After oxygen, you get a noble gas, argon, which reacts with essentially nothing, hence why its family is known as the noble gases, and that leaves carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases as about 0.037%, or carbon dioxide in particular is 0.037%. That is 370 parts per million, or ppm. Parts per million are very much like percent, but out of a million instead of 100, and it's useful for gases that have a very small concentration. And indeed, there's actually, absolutely speaking, not that much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But the compounds that are present in small amounts, the system is often very sensitive to changes in that. And this is true in a geochemistry context also. Sometimes the concentrations of elements like rubidium and strontium that aren't especially common are very sensitive to changes in geologic processes. Meanwhile, you have water vapor, which is about a little less than 0.5% over the entire atmosphere, but it is very highly variable. And at sea level, it's 1% because you have a lot more water evaporating right there. And one thing to consider is that in general, outside of water vapor, the chemical composition of the atmosphere isn't that variable as you go from bottom to top. However, gas has mass, and because of gravity, 99% of that mass is close to Earth's surface. So the atmosphere feels thinner as you go up because actually the air molecules are most concentrated at the bottom. The pressure is lower because you have fewer gas molecules present in the upper portions of the atmosphere, and that's also why it's harder to breathe up there, because what oxygen is up there is much more spread out, much less dense. So then let's talk a little bit about Earth's atmospheric physical structure. Earth's atmosphere is layered, and you can see that there's some interesting changes in temperature that occur as you go up. Now, the air in these different layers has distinctly different densities, and a general rule is that things with different densities don't mix well. Density differences contribute to why oil and water don't mix. Now, in that case, chemistry is also involved. In the case of the atmosphere, the actual chemical composition doesn't vary all that much from the troposphere to the thermosphere, but the density is different that very little mixing occurs. This will come up again with oceanic circulation because there's a similar separation of layers or stratification in the ocean. Now, most weather occurs in what is known as the troposphere, the top 10 or so kilometers of the atmosphere. And The temperature decreases in the troposphere as you go up because you are farther from Earth's infrared radiation, which actually more effectively heats the air, and that is actually what powers most weather, because the gases thin out as you move up in the atmosphere, and heat has to be transferred from particle to particle. It really can't anyhow, space is cold because there are few to no gas particles out there that can transfer heat to our bodies. I do want to briefly talk about the difference between weather and climate. Weather is not the same as climate. Climate relies on big picture statistics like average rainfall, average humidity, average temperatures, and these are all numbers that come as an estimate taken from many individual data points. And this incorporates it also incorporates a way to even out variations from, say, solar variation. And how much seasonal variation there is in a given area is one aspect of climate, in fact. A weather measurement is just a single day's rainfall or temperature. And those data can go into a large database that, when averaged out, can produce climate data. But you can't make claims about the climate based on rainfall and temperature and air pressure for just one day, because a place with a dry climate overall might still have a rainy day or two, and that will be important, especially for the weather, for the wildlife there, but it's still going to be a desert overall because its long-term climate is that of a dry area. And so most weather, either way, storms, rainfall, etc., that pretty much all occurs in the troposphere. And above that, we have the stratosphere, which has the all-important ozone layer. And the temperature in the ozone layer actually increases as you go higher, and that is a direct result of the ozone. The ozone molecules in the ozone layer are continually being destroyed and reformed, which releases large amounts of energy. And it's stronger near the top of the stratosphere because that's where solar radiation reaches more strongly. And the ozone layer has entirely to do actually with incoming solar radiation. Now, ozone is an oddity. I mentioned that oxygen is usually present in the form of O2 gas, but ozone is O3, which is a gas molecule in which you have 3 oxygen molecules bonded. And ozone accumulates near the poles due to circulation patterns that we'll talk more about in the second half of this lecture. So the ozone layer is traditionally thickest at the poles and thinnest at the equator. It's measured in what's known as a Dobson unit, in which a single Dobson unit is equivalent to a thickness of 0.01 millimeters thickness at 0 degrees Celsius and 1 atmosphere of pressure. And that lets you measure thickness without having to worry about pressure and temperature, because the density of things and so their thickness as a result varies as a result of pressure and temperature. And ozone in the stratosphere is by and large a good thing because it is stopping some of the ultraviolet radiation from reaching the Earth. That ultraviolet radiation instead gets used up in inciting the destruction and reconstruction of ozone back into O2. The UV light gets converted into thermal energy. The ozone molecules are in a way sort of wearing the ultraviolet light out and letting it turn into relatively harmless thermal energy instead. Somewhat ironically, ozone in the troposphere, the lower level of the atmosphere, is a pollutant. It is released by some industrial processes, and it is part of smog. And it also normally disintegrates before it has the chance to reach the stratosphere. So it doesn't really have much of a potential to fix ozone depletion. And it is a nasty pollutant while it lingers around. And indeed, human activities are depleting the ozone in the stratosphere, which is where we really, really need it. Now, the halogens are another group of elements. They're next to the noble gases on the periodic table, but unlike the noble gases, they are extremely reactive, in part because of electron considerations, because they are very likely to gain an extra electron. Now, chlorine, fluorine, and bromine, and to a lesser extent iodine. Iodine is a liquid, so it doesn't tend to volatilize as much, but chlorine, fluorine, and bromine are frequently become gases or become parts of gases. And there's a group of gases known as the CFCs, or the chlorinated fluorocarbons, that contain chlorine and fluorine atoms in them. And the fluorine in particular is what makes them so destructive, because the fluorine will interact with ozone without allowing for the replenishment that occurs when ozone reacts with itself and produces O2 instead. And the problem with CFCs is that they were commonly used as carrier gases to transport material in aerosol cans, or used as coolant gases in refrigerators, and this was when nobody really knew that they would subsequently stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years and cause ozone to break down. CFCs are indeed long-lived, and one molecule can also interact with ozone over and over again and destroy thousands of molecules of stratospheric ozone. And not to mention that CFCs will actually reach the stratosphere and accumulate at the poles the same way that ozone does. And that has produced an ozone hole at the pole, a place with a much thinner ozone layer than expected. And these reactions are actually sped up by cold temperatures, which is one reason why the depletion is so pronounced in Antarctica. And I will also mention that there are compounds other than CFCs that cause this destruction of ozone. A number of nitrous oxide compounds, largely from emissions of jet fuels, also do this. Now, the Antarctic ozone hole is especially bad for a number of reasons, but it becomes most noticeable during the Antarctic spring, when, after a long cold winter, in which polar stratospheric clouds have formed. No sunlight reaches Antarctica during the winter, and low pressure in the stratosphere leads to a strong wind developing around the entire continent, the polar vortex, and this isolates the very cold polar air. The air, if it drops below 80 degrees, will see the formation of polar stratospheric clouds. And polar stratospheric clouds are made of large droplets of water forming along with nitric acid, which actually is something that comes from the jet emissions. This produces nitric acid trihydrate. And it produces these clouds that, instead of being made of simple ice, are made of nitric acid trihydrate. And as a result of the presence of these compounds, which are very destructive to ozone, as well as CFCs that get trapped in the vortex, by the time spring comes around and the vortex ceases to be a thing, the ozone will have very badly been depleted below normal. Anything less than 220 Dobson units is considered to be below normal, and it shows up on here as this blue hole, where there is simply less ozone than you would expect. And this will recover over the summer as ozone from elsewhere seeps back in, but this will then, the exact same problem will resume in the summer. And ozone depletion is bad for a number of reasons, largely to do with the fact that more ultraviolet light is reaching the surface and causing damage to us. We can get cancer from increased exposure to ultraviolet light, as well as our eyes can suffer. Amphibians, meanwhile, which frog populations worldwide have plummeted, and some of that has been attributed to increased ultraviolet radiation from ozone depletion. And also in the Southern Ocean, ultraviolet light hurts the single-celled plankton that make up the base of the Antarctic food chain, which we'll talk more about in the ecology unit later on. So CFCs and nitric acid were first proposed to be dangerous in the 70s, when scientists came to the conclusion that continued production of CFCs would destroy the ozone layer. Many other scientists agreed with them, but the industry fought tooth and nail to cast them as liars and job killers, and also called them communists, because nobody wants to be a communist in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s especially. So less than a decade later, in 1985, it was clear that they were right. There was a gigantic ozone hole over the Antarctic, and most industrialized nations, including the US, signed the Montreal Protocol in 1987, which phased out production of CFCs by 2030, and also regulated what airlines could use in their fuel to a much greater extent. The hole has become less pronounced, and this has been cited as a success story and as a potential template for future climate change agreements. I will say, though, that CFCs are a bit less of what society relies on CFCs, a bit less than fossil fuels. So the fossil fuel dependence is harder to shake, even if the need for that is really abundantly clear. Leaving the stratosphere and the ozone layer behind at last, we get to the mesosphere, where temperatures again begin to decrease as we head away from the ozone layer. And this is where meteors are when you see them burn up, because they encounter more air resistance from the heavily stratified layers of gas. The mesosphere is more dense than the overlying thermosphere. And the thermosphere, as well as the exosphere, which is kind of the boundary between the atmosphere and outer space, represent the end of the atmosphere and the beginning of space. And somewhat confusingly, there is very little gas, but the temperature increases once again as you go up. a lot of this is because the solar radiation is reaching this layer first, not to mention that even though there are so few gas molecules, because there are so few of them, the ones that are present can zoom for a very long time before colliding with other gas molecules, and they will build up a lot of energy before the collision, and the collision will release a lot of energy to the surrounding area. This layer is where the southern and northern lights occur, and the aurora australis, or the southern lights, are related to another sphere that relates to magnetics, not layers of the atmosphere, the magnetosphere. And that is the region in which space will feel the magnetic pull of the Earth, such that any charged particles passing through the magnetosphere will be affected by Earth. And the aurora occurs as fast-moving electrons are interacting with gas molecules in the atmosphere. These fast electrons are from the solar wind, which is being deflected mostly by Earth's magnetic field. The field is actually weaker at the poles, in a sense. The magnetic lines are vertical there, and they converge around the north and south magnetic poles. So more charged particles can enter the atmosphere at the very top or at the very bottom. And this leads to increased interactions between the solar wind electrons and gas molecules, and flare-ups in the thermosphere that are visible to us on the ground as the southern lights. So changes in the patterns of the lights are thought to signal potential changes in Earth's magnetic field, which we'll come back to with plate tectonics. And in the slightly shorter second half of this lecture, I'll talk more about what happens to the solar radiation as it reaches Earth. It causes air to move, and we'll come back to that in the second half.